Their displacement is of no concern to me. You will process the order immediately.
He told the solicitor she was easily replaced. There is a specific kind of silence that accumulates in a house where a woman has been making herself indispensable for so long that the house has simply stopped noticing her. Not a cold silence, something worse than cold. The silence of assumption. The silence of a machine that runs so smoothly that no one in the room has thought to wonder who is keeping it running, or what would happen if she stopped. Eleanor Ashby had been that silence for 7 years. She had understood this, in the quiet internal way that intelligent women understand uncomfortable truths they have not yet decided what to do with, for at least the last 2 of those 7 years. She understood it the way she understood the household accounts, with complete clarity, without drama, and with the specific patience of someone who files a piece of information away not because she intends to ignore it but because she intends to use it at the correct moment, and the correct moment has not yet presented itself. The correct moment, as it turned out, presented itself on a Tuesday in October, at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning, in the corridor outside her husband's private study. But to understand that corridor, to understand what it felt like to stand in it and hear those 4 specific words through a door that was fractionally ajar, you need to understand what Eleanor Ashby had been before she became Eleanor Ravensworth, Duchess of half a county and footnote in the story of a man who had decided, somewhere in the comfortable middle years of their marriage, that she was simply part of the furniture. Eleanor Ashby had grown up in a house where women were taught, from the age at which they were old enough to be taught anything, that their value resided entirely in what they could provide. Her father had not been a cruel man, he was a practical one, which amounts to the same outcome when you are the daughter. He had surveyed his 3 children and made the following calculations: the eldest boy would inherit, the second boy would take a commission, and Eleanor would marry well and be grateful for it. He had not considered whether Eleanor had opinions about this arrangement, not because he did not care for her but because it genuinely had not occurred to him that her opinion was a relevant variable. Eleanor had opinions about almost everything. She kept most of them in a small journal that lived behind the second shelf of the library, tucked between a collection of her grandmother's letters and a guide to medicinal herbs that no one in the house had opened in 30 years. She had been keeping this journal since she was 14. By the time she married Aldous Ravensworth at the age of 21, the journal had expanded to 4 volumes. She did not bring it to Ravensworth House. She left it in the library, behind the herbs, because some part of her understood even then that the woman who had written those 4 volumes was going to have to exist very quietly for some time, and that the journals would be safer without her nearby. Aldous Ravensworth had courted Eleanor with the specific, efficient charm of a man who has identified what he requires and is going about procuring it in an organized fashion. He needed a wife of good family and sufficient intelligence to manage the social and administrative demands of a dukedom, demands that were, if one were being precise about it, considerable. He needed someone who would not embarrass him in company, who would handle the correspondence and the household and the charitable engagements and the management of the tenant farms with the competence of a well-run business, and who would do all of this without requiring the particular kind of romantic attention that he considered, privately, an inefficient use of a man's time. Eleanor's father had considered this an excellent match. Eleanor had considered Aldous Ravensworth carefully, had noted his intelligence and his efficiency and the fact that he occasionally said something that suggested depth beneath the surface, and had decided that this was the best available option and that she would make something of it. She had. That was the painful truth of it. She had made something remarkable of it. She had taken the Ravensworth social calendar, a chaotic, undermanaged collection of obligations and grudges that Aldous's previous system had allowed to grow into something resembling an uncleared forest, and in the first 3 years of their marriage had turned it into a model of efficiency and warmth that made Ravensworth House the kind of establishment people actively sought invitations to. She had managed the correspondence for 3 estates, had handled the tenant disputes on the northern properties with a diplomatic precision that had reduced the legal costs by 40%. She had navigated the complex social geography of 3 London seasons without a single incident that could be laid at the Ravensworth name, which was a considerably more difficult achievement than anyone who had not attempted it could understand. She had done all of this and said very little about it, because that was what was expected, and because she was, for the first few years, genuinely trying to build something. She had believed, with the earnest and slightly desperate belief of someone who has committed fully to a course of action, that Aldous would eventually notice. That the efficiency she created would translate, by some reasonable process, into the kind of partnership that made a marriage worth being in. In this she was wrong. Not wrong immediately, wrong gradually, which is so much worse, because it does not arrive as a blow you can brace against. It arrives as an accumulation of small recognitions, each individually survivable, collectively devastating. The first recognition, Aldous did not discuss the estates with her. He received her reports and acted on her recommendations without comment, which at first she had read as trust and eventually understood was simply absence. It had not occurred to him to have a conversation about the things she had spent her week thinking through. It had not occurred to him because she was thinking about it, and therefore it was handled, and therefore he did not need to think about it at all. The second recognition, he had stopped attending the social occasions she organized for them as a couple. Not all of them, the ones that mattered to his own ambitions he attended with the precise charm he could deploy when it served him. But the quieter engagements, the dinners with people she had cultivated, the county assemblies that built the kind of relationships that paid dividends over years rather than immediately, those he left to her. He would read her summary notes afterward and occasionally comment that she had done well. He said this the way a man might compliment a well-trained horse. The third recognition, arriving in the 5th year of their marriage with the particular clarity of something that has been approaching from a long distance and has finally arrived at your door, there was a woman named Mrs. Helena Forsyth, a widow with considerable independent income and the specific sort of beauty that photographs extremely well, and Aldous had been attending the kind of engagements he left to Eleanor when Mrs. Forsyth was likely to be present. Eleanor had found out the way she found out most things that people did not intend her to know, by being so thoroughly part of the household machinery that people forgot she was in the room when they said things they would not have said if they had remembered. She had not wept. She had not confronted him. She had placed this new piece of information alongside everything else she already knew, and she had gone to visit her mother. Mrs. Dorothy Ashby lived in the small but perfectly maintained townhouse in Kensington that Eleanor's marriage settlement had provided for her, and she served Eleanor tea with the warm, slightly anxious efficiency of a woman who knew something was wrong and was hoping the tea would somehow help. Eleanor drank the tea and watched her mother's hands and considered what it would mean to say aloud the thing she had been thinking for the last 18 months, which was that she had made a significant error at 21 and was now trying to calculate what it would cost her to correct it. She said none of this. She said that everything was quite all right and the Ravensworth accounts were in excellent order and the Northern estate had had a very productive quarter. Mrs. Dorothy had covered Eleanor's hand with her own and said nothing, because she felt everything at the precise frequency that Eleanor had learned to contain, and she knew that her daughter was not going to say the true thing until she was ready, and that the best she could offer until that moment was her hand and her presence and the particular warmth of a mother who has been inadequate in so many ways and knows it and loves you anyway with everything she has. Eleanor had squeezed her mother's hand and gone home. That night she had taken out, for the first time in 7 years, the small journal. Not to read it, to add to it. She had written 3 pages. They were the most precise 3 pages she had ever written. And at the bottom of the 3rd page she had written, "I need to know what my father's settlement actually says." Because Eleanor Ashby, née of good family and considerable suppressed intelligence, had a father who had been a practical man, and a practical man, whatever his other failures, had also been a man who had read people correctly, and who had, before Eleanor married Aldous Ravensworth, arranged the marriage settlement with a solicitor he trusted entirely and with terms he had insisted upon with the particular stubborn insistence of a man who had looked at Aldous Ravensworth and seen something. That made him careful. Eleanor had not read the settlement in full at the time. She had been 21 and in the grip of a decision she had already committed to, and the full legal text of a marriage settlement is not the kind of reading that a 21-year-old on the edge of her wedding receives with any genuine attention. She was 28 now. She read it in full that night by candlelight, the study to herself for once because Aldous was at his club. She read every word. She made notes in the margin in her small precise handwriting. By the time the candle burned to its socket, Eleanor Ashby had understood 3 things with complete clarity. The first, her father had been significantly more protective of her interests than she had known. The second, Aldous Ravensworth had been significantly less aware of the specifics of that protection than he had believed. The third, she needed to speak, as soon as possible, with her father's solicitor, not Mr. Vane, who was Aldous's man and had always been Aldous's man, but Mr. Alastair Pemberton, who had been her father's solicitor for 30 years and who had drawn up the settlement terms and who had shaken her hand the morning of her wedding with an expression she had not been able to read at the time and could now read perfectly. He had been telling her, with a handshake, that she was not without recourse. That whenever she needed it, there was a door she could open. Eleanor put on her gloves. She wrote a letter to Mr. Pemberton. She sealed it and addressed it and put it in the post herself, at 11:30 at night, walking to the post box at the corner of the street in the October dark, because there were some letters you did not trust to a household that was not entirely your own. She went back inside, and she went to bed, and she lay in the dark and thought with complete, furious clarity about everything she was going to do next. She was 28 years old. She had 7 years of irreplaceable organizational intelligence invested in a house and a marriage that had just told her, in the casual way of something that does not consider your feelings a relevant variable, that she was simply a contingency rather than a person. Eleanor Ashby had spent her entire life being someone else's contingency. She had decided, sometime around 11:30 on that October night, that she was finished. The letter to Mr. Pemberton was sent on a Monday. He replied by Thursday, with the precise efficiency of a man who recognized the weight of what was being asked and moved accordingly. His reply was brief and specific. He would see her at her earliest convenience, at a time and location of her choosing, and she should bring whatever documentation she had access to, particularly anything pertaining to the original settlement terms. Eleanor arranged to meet him the following Wednesday at her mother's house in Kensington, neutral ground, familiar, with Mrs. Dorothy in residence to provide cover in the event that anyone inquired about the purpose of her morning visit. Between sending the letter and receiving the reply, she had told no one. Not her mother, not Constance, not a single member of the household. She had continued to manage the correspondence, to oversee the staff schedules, to attend the 2 social engagements on the calendar that week with the specific composed warmth she had spent 7 years perfecting. She had sat across the breakfast table from Aldous each morning and poured the tea and read her letters and said the appropriate things in the appropriate tones, and no one in the room would have seen any difference. Constance saw a difference the moment she walked through the door on Tuesday morning. She took one look at Eleanor across the drawing room and said, with the surgical precision she reserved for when it was absolutely necessary, "Something has happened." Eleanor looked at her oldest friend, at the bright dark eyes and the warm deep brown face and the expression that meant Constance had already identified the shape of the problem and was simply waiting for Eleanor to confirm the edges. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Something has happened. I will tell you everything on Wednesday. This is not a situation for your drawing room voice." Constance sat down. She folded her gloved hands. She said, "My drawing room voice is one of the finest instruments I have ever developed." "I know," Eleanor said. "Wednesday." Constance looked at her for one additional searching moment, then said, "If it involves that man doing something irreversible, I want you to know that I have 17 ideas and 3 of them are technically legal." Eleanor said, "Wednesday, Constance." On Tuesday evening, entirely unplanned, the Tuesday that changed everything, Eleanor went looking for the estate accounts manager. He was supposed to be in the household office at the back of the first floor with the quarterly reports from the northern properties. Eleanor had reviewed them that morning and found a discrepancy she wanted to query before it went to Aldous. A small discrepancy. The kind of thing she caught routinely, quietly, without anyone in the household understanding that the accounts were as clean as they were because she looked at every number before it went anywhere. The household office was empty. She checked the corridor. She heard voices. From the study. From Aldous's private study, the door fractionally open, the voices carrying in the specific way of men who believe themselves entirely alone in a house and have stopped measuring their volume. She heard Mr. Vane first, the careful, slightly suppressed voice of a professional delivering an uncomfortable subject matter with the professional smoothness of someone who has been paid to do so. He was discussing the marriage settlement. He was discussing the dowry properties. He was discussing, in the particular Latinate language of legal documentation, the question of what the estate could access in the event that the current arrangement required reconsideration. And then she heard Aldous. Not shouting. Never shouting. Aldous Ravensworth did not shout because he had never needed to. His voice was entirely, specifically pleasant, the pleasantness of a man who is discussing something he considers already decided, who is working through logistics rather than deliberating on principle. She is easily replaced, Aldous said. The concern about managing the changeover is entirely manageable. Find me someone efficient. Someone who will not require significant handling. And then, after a pause in which Eleanor stood in the corridor and heard her 7 years of marriage distilled into a practical consideration about staffing requirements, the properties will need to be re-evaluated once the settlement terms are confirmed. Find me a route through the entailment. There should be one. Eleanor had, at the age of 14, once witnessed a horse lose its footing on a frozen path, watched the whole certain weight of the animal simply give way in a single unrecoverable second. She had never forgotten the specific sound of it. The wrong sound, the sound of something solid discovering it is not, actually, solid. She heard that sound now. Inside herself. Privately, and very briefly, because Eleanor Ashby had 7 years of practice at containing the sounds her interior life made, and she contained this one too, standing in the corridor with the household correspondence in her hands and her grey-green eyes on the fractional gap in the door. She gave herself precisely 30 seconds. She counted them. This was something she had learned to do at 23, in the 3rd year of the marriage, when she had first understood that the gap between what she felt and what she showed had to be managed deliberately or it would simply overflow at the worst possible moment. 30 seconds. The breath in, the breath out, the feeling acknowledged and then placed where it belonged, which was not here, not in this corridor, not with Mr. Vane's carefully modulated voice still audible through the door. At 30 seconds, Eleanor lowered the household correspondence to her side. She looked at the door. She thought about 7 years. About the household accounts and the tenant disputes and the London season and the letters written and the obligations managed and the problems solved. About the furniture that runs itself, that everyone benefits from and no one acknowledges. She thought about the settlement terms she had read by candlelight. About Mr. Pemberton's brief, precise reply letter. About the specific language her father had insisted on, with the stubborn insistence of a man who had read Aldous Ravensworth correctly and decided to act accordingly. She thought about the portfolio. The dowry portfolio, which was in the study, on the corner of the desk where the estate documents lived, because Eleanor had brought it there herself 2 days ago when she had been cross-referencing the settlement terms against the quarterly accounts and had left it there meaning to return it to the household files and had not yet done so. She thought, the door is open. She pushed it open fully and walked in. Aldous looked up from the desk with the mild, slightly impatient expression of a man who has been interrupted. Mr. Vane straightened in the visitor's chair and adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with a specific rapid gesture that Eleanor recognized as the gesture of a man recalibrating very quickly. Eleanor looked at them both for a long moment. She did not speak immediately. She crossed the study to the desk, her footsteps even and deliberate on the carpet, her posture carrying the specific contained precision that 7 years of careful management had built, and she looked at the documents spread before them. She recognized the settlement documents. Mr. Vane had them. She looked at Mr. Vane. She looked at the documents. She looked at Aldous, who was looking at her with the calm, slight wariness of a man who has registered that something unexpected is occurring but has not yet identified what. Then she looked at the dowry portfolio, on the corner of the desk. Her father's seal on the cover. Her name on the label in her father's handwriting. She picked it up. Both hands, steady. She closed the cover. She tucked it under her right arm the way she tucked everything that was hers when she was done with a room, the composition of someone completing a task, moving on to the next. Aldous's pale blue eyes moved from her face to the portfolio. His hand moved, involuntarily, to the gold signet ring. Eleanor did not look at him again. She had already looked at everything in this room that required looking at. She had looked at her marriage with the same complete, unsparing attention she brought to the estate accounts, and she had identified the discrepancy, and she had reached the same conclusion she always reached when the accounts showed a figure that did not balance. The figure needed correcting, and the correction started now. She walked to the door. She opened it. She walked out. The door closed behind her. Not loudly. The quiet close was something she had learned from Aldous, that the most effective exits do not announce themselves. The corridor was exactly as she had left it. The household correspondence was still in her left hand. Her right hand was holding the dowry portfolio under her arm. Her footsteps on the hall carpet carried her to the front entrance without pause, without hesitation, without a single backward look at the study door or the portraits on the walls or the chandelier above the staircase that she had spent 2 seasons supervising the restoration of. She went through the front door. The October air was cold and specific after the warmth of the house. Her carriage was at the side. She had not ordered it, but the footman who had been watching the door since the household accounts runner had failed to locate the estate manager had correctly assessed that her grace was moving with the energy of a woman who would want a carriage imminently, and had it ready. Eleanor got in. She told the driver her mother's address in Kensington. She placed the portfolio on her knees and her hands flat on top of it, and she looked out the window at the Ravensworth townhouse as the carriage moved away from it, at the stone facade and the tall windows and the front door through which she had passed every day for 7 years. She watched it until it was out of sight. Then she looked down at the portfolio in her hands, and she breathed, and she let herself feel, for 3 blocks and 3 blocks only, the full weight of everything she had just walked out of and everything she was about to do. At the 4th block she straightened. She opened the portfolio. She began reading. Mr. Alastair Pemberton's offices were located on a quiet street in the legal quarter of London, and they smelled the way that all genuinely useful places smell, of old paper and preparation. The man himself was 63, broad through the chest, with a silver beard trimmed with professional precision and the kind of eyes that had spent 4 decades in law and had emerged from that experience with an absolutely accurate sense of what they were looking at and a complete disinclination to pretend otherwise. He had been Eleanor's father's solicitor for 30 years. He had drawn up the marriage settlement. He had shaken Eleanor's hand on her wedding morning with an expression that had meant, "You are not without recourse, and I will be here when you need it." He rose from behind his desk when Eleanor entered his office on Wednesday, with her mother's Kensington townhouse as cover and the dowry portfolio under her arm, and Constance Marrow seated very alertly in the carriage outside because Eleanor had told her everything that morning, finally, over her mother's tea table, and Constance had listened with the focused, still attention of a woman who is receiving tactical information and has stopped performing social ease because this is not a situation for social ease. Constance had said, when Eleanor finished, "What do you need from me?" Eleanor had said, "Stay in the carriage. If I need 17 ideas, I will come and get you." Constance had nodded once, precisely, and put on her gloves, and followed Eleanor to the carriage without another word. Mr. Pemberton took the portfolio from Eleanor's hands and opened it. He reviewed it with the unhurried attention of a man who wrote the document and does not need reminding of its contents but is confirming that what is in front of him matches what he knows it to be. He opened the settlement documents. He reviewed the specific clauses Eleanor had noted during her candlelit reading the week before. He looked up. "You have read it fully," he said. It was not a question. "I read it 7 days ago." Eleanor sat across from his desk with her hands folded on her knees with the composure of a woman who has had a week to move from the feeling to the plan and is now firmly inside the plan. "I should have read it the day I signed it." "Your father tried to explain the key provisions to you," Mr. Pemberton said. "You were 21 and about to be married and had no particular reason to believe the provisions would ever be relevant. They are relevant now." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Tell me what I have." Mr. Pemberton set the portfolio on the desk between them. He placed his hands flat on either side of it in the posture of a man who is about to say something he has been prepared to say for some time. He told her what her father had built. The 3 northern estates, the Ashby properties that had come with the marriage, that had been the material value Eleanor had brought to a match that made her, on paper, an advantageous bride, were not, as Aldous Ravensworth and his solicitor had apparently been calculating, accessible to the Duke through the existing settlement. Eleanor's father had insisted, with the particular stubborn insistence of a man who had read Aldous Ravensworth correctly and trusted neither his stability nor his intentions toward his daughter's financial security, on a settlement provision that placed the Ashby properties in a separate legal instrument bearing Eleanor's name alone, registered independently of the marriage, with transfer restrictions that required her explicit written consent and the countersignature of her own independently appointed solicitor, which was Pemberton, before any property action could be taken. Aldous Ravensworth could not touch the Ashby properties. He had never been able to touch them. He had apparently believed, for 7 years, that the properties were part of the general estate and accessible to him as her husband, and no one, not Mr. Vane, who had apparently failed to read the settlement documents with the attention they deserved, or who had read them and said nothing, had corrected this understanding. Eleanor sat with this for a long moment. "He does not know," she said. "He has never been advised of the restriction in terms he appears to have understood," Mr. Pemberton said carefully. "This is not an uncommon situation. The settlement documents are thorough, and solicitors who have not originated them do not always read them as carefully as they should." Eleanor looked at the portfolio on the desk between them. "What can he do," she asked, "when he discovers this?" Mr. Pemberton adjusted his hands on the desk. He considered the question with the careful precision of a man thinking through every avenue. "He could contest the restriction," Mr. Pemberton said. "On very limited grounds. The settlement was registered independently, before the marriage, with terms that are unambiguous. A contest would require him to argue that the terms were unreasonable, which they are not, or that they were not properly communicated, which they were. He could attempt a prolonged legal challenge. It would be expensive, it would be public, and on the current terms it would almost certainly fail." A pause. "What it would do," Mr. Pemberton continued, "is create a period of considerable public difficulty while the challenge was in process." Eleanor said, "Is there a route that avoids that period?" Mr. Pemberton looked at her with the calm, full attention he had been giving her since she walked through the door. "There is," he said. "But it requires moving before he becomes aware of the restriction and engages his own advisors in a formal challenge. Once the challenge is filed, the timeline extends significantly. If you move first, if the properties are formally confirmed as independently registered and the documentation is lodged with the appropriate authority before Ravensworth's solicitor has time to mount a formal response, the position becomes considerably more secure." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "How quickly can you move?" she said. Mr. Pemberton had the expression of a man who has been waiting to be asked this question for some years. "I have been maintaining the relevant registration since your father died," he said. "The documentation is current. If you choose to formally invoke the settlement terms, I can complete the necessary filings within the week." Eleanor picked up the portfolio from the desk. She stood. She tucked it under her arm with the same deliberate composure with which she had picked it up from Aldous' desk. "Then please," she said, "begin." Mr. Pemberton reached for his pen. He made a notation at the top of a clean page in his professional ledger, the careful handwriting of a man recording the beginning of something significant. He looked up at Eleanor with the precise, unhurried look of a solicitor who has spent 30 years preparing for exactly this. "There is one additional matter," he said. "In the event that the settlement documentation is filed and the restriction confirmed, what do you intend to do with the Ashby properties?" Eleanor looked out the window at the grey October London street below, at the carriage where Constance was sitting in focused readiness, at the ordinary city going about its ordinary business entirely unaware that a woman had just walked out of her own house with the thing that changed everything tucked under her arm. "Manage them," she said simply. "As I have been doing for 7 years, except this time correctly, and under my own name." She looked back at Mr. Pemberton. "And I believe it is time I had my own offices." Aldous Ravensworth did not come to her, the afternoon she walked out of the study. He sent Mr. Vane instead. Mr. Vane arrived at her mother's Kensington address at 4 o'clock, which told her that Aldous had needed several hours to decide how to respond, which told her that he was less certain of his position than his voice in the study had suggested, which told her that somewhere in the legal recesses of his understanding he was beginning to calculate what the dowry portfolio meant in her hands rather than on his desk. Mr. Vane was received by Mrs. Dorothy Ashby with the specific courteous warmth of a woman who has served enough difficult people tea over the years to do so without any particular expression, and who brought him to the small sitting room and poured the tea and sat down with him and waited for him to conduct his errand, because Mrs. Dorothy Ashby had been briefed by Eleanor that morning and was in the full possession of the kind of composed maternal fury that is the most useful thing a mother can offer when her daughter has finally decided to stop accepting what she should never have had to accept. Constance was also present, which Mr. Vane had not anticipated and which visibly unnerved him. Lady Constance Marrow at the tea table with her dark bright eyes and her very still hands was an entirely specific kind of audience for a man who had come to deliver a diplomatic message and found himself instead in a room full of women who were already 17 steps ahead of his message. Eleanor was not present. Eleanor was at Mr. Pemberton's offices, reviewing the first stage of the documentation. She had sent her apologies to Mr. Vane through Mrs. Dorothy, with the specific language that he could report to his client, that she was otherwise engaged with a matter of significant estate importance and would be happy to discuss the Ravensworth household arrangements once the relevant documentation had been confirmed with her solicitor. The documentation, Mr. Pemberton had confirmed that afternoon, was filing that day. Mr. Vane drank the tea. He delivered his message with the professional efficiency of a man who has no idea what he has walked into. The message was, the Duke wished to speak with Her Grace at her earliest convenience regarding the misunderstanding of that morning, and he hoped she would not do anything precipitous. Constance, whose idea of 17 things would have been precipitous by anyone's definition and legal by approximately 3 of them, said nothing. She smiled instead, which was, everyone in the room felt, considerably more effective. Mrs. Dorothy said that she would pass the message along and that she was sure everything could be resolved in a reasonable manner once everyone had had time to review the relevant documents. Mr. Vane adjusted his spectacles. He seemed to feel, obscurely, that something was happening in this room that he was not in possession of all the information to understand. He was correct. The relevant documents, as it turned out, were filed by Mr. Pemberton at the registry office on Thursday morning. The Ashby properties, all 3 northern estates, the income properties that had been the operational anchor of the Ravensworth accounts for 7 years, were formally confirmed under their independent registration, with Eleanor Ashby, née Ashby, listed as sole owner, the settlement terms clearly noted, the transfer restrictions registered and active. On Friday morning, Aldous Ravensworth received a formal communication from Mr. Alastair Pemberton, solicitor, notifying him that the Ashby-Ravensworth marriage settlement had been formally invoked by the primary party and that all correspondence relating to the Ashby properties should henceforth be directed to Mr. Pemberton's offices. Eleanor was told later, by Constance, who had heard it from the Ravensworth footman, who had heard it from the Ravensworth cook, who had been present in the corridor, that Aldous read the letter at the breakfast table, set it down very carefully beside his coffee cup, and sat for several minutes without speaking. Then he sent for Mr. Vane. Mr. Vane arrived at the Ravensworth town house at 10 o'clock and spent 3 hours in the study with Aldous reviewing the settlement documents, the full settlement documents, in their entirety, for what appeared to be the first time, and emerged with the expression of a man who has discovered that he should have read something more carefully 7 years ago. Which is a specific expression that sits very unpleasantly on the face of someone who is professionally paid to read things carefully. Eleanor was not at the Ravensworth townhouse for any of this. She was at the offices she had retained in Mayfair, in the small but well-appointed suite of rooms that Mr. Pemberton had identified through a business contact as available on short notice, where she had spent Thursday afternoon and Friday morning organizing her correspondence, confirming the addresses of the 3 Ashby estate managers, drafting the letters that would inform them that management correspondence should now be directed to her offices rather than to the Ravensworth household, and setting up, with the same quiet efficient thoroughness she had applied to everything she had ever managed, the structure of a life that was now, formally and legally and completely, her own. Constance came on Saturday. She came with her carriage and her best hat and a bottle of very good champagne, which she opened in Eleanor's new sitting room with the precise professional authority of a woman who has been waiting for this specific occasion. She poured 2 glasses. She handed one to Eleanor. She raised her own. She said, to the correct use of legal instruments. Eleanor raised her glass. To my father, she said. Who read people correctly. They drank. Mrs. Dorothy arrived at the new offices on Sunday, with a trunk of Eleanor's personal belongings from the Kensington house and a small pot of violets and the expression of a woman who had been quietly terrified for the last 7 years and is only now beginning to exhale. She placed the violets on the window ledge without being asked, because violets on a window ledge were the thing Mrs. Dorothy Ashby did when she wanted to say that a room was now a home and she did not have the words for it. Eleanor found herself, standing in her new offices on that Sunday afternoon with the violets on the ledge and her mother's hand in hers and the Ashby estate correspondence already sorted on her desk, experiencing a feeling she had not experienced in some time and had almost stopped expecting. The feeling was, this is where I am supposed to be. On Monday morning, 2 letters arrived. The first was from Aldous. Brief, controlled, the language of a man who was carefully not saying the things he had perhaps initially wanted to say and had been advised by counsel not to say. He acknowledged the settlement terms. He proposed a meeting to discuss the arrangements. He expressed hope that matters could be managed with appropriate discretion. Eleanor read it with the complete, unhurried attention she gave all correspondence, and she set it aside. The second letter was from Mr. Vane. Shorter, considerably less controlled, and revealing in its brevity the extent of what the preceding week had cost his professional composure. He requested, on behalf of his client, that Her Grace reconsider the timing of the documentation filing and allow for a period of negotiation before any further legal steps were taken. Eleanor looked at this letter for a longer moment. She picked up her pen. She wrote to Mr. Vane that she was happy to arrange a meeting, that all correspondence relating to the Ashby properties should be directed to Mr. Pemberton's offices, and that she was entirely available to discuss the management arrangements at their mutual convenience. She did not write that she had already spoken to all 3 Northern estate managers, who had responded to her direct communication with what she could only describe as relief, each of them noting in slightly different language that they had been hoping for some time for a more direct line of communication with the actual owner of the properties. She did not write that the accounts from all 3 estates, reviewed now without the intermediary of the Ravensworth household, were in considerably better order than she had been able to manage through that intermediary. She did not write any of this. She sealed the letter. She gave it to her new assistant. She picked up the next piece of correspondence. She had work to do. She had, in fact, a great deal of work to do. For the first time in 7 years, every bit of it was hers. Eleanor met with Aldous 3 weeks later. They met at the neutral territory of Mr. Pemberton's offices with both solicitors present, which was the correct way to conduct this particular conversation and which Aldous had agreed to with the specific slightly tired acceptance of a man who has spent 3 weeks reviewing documentation that has not improved with review. He looked, in those 3 weeks, slightly different, not diminished exactly, because Aldous Ravensworth did not diminish easily, but present in a way he had not always been present, which was to say that he was looking at her. Actually looking. With the genuine attention that the prospect of a legal proceeding produces in men who have not previously found it necessary to pay genuine attention, because the world had simply always complied without requiring it. Eleanor looked back at him with the same grey-green eyes and the same composed precision she had brought to 7 years of managing his household and the same complete absence of either anger or conciliation, because this meeting was not about feelings, it was about terms, and she had spent 3 weeks preparing the terms with the thoroughness she brought to all things she prepared. The terms were the following. The Ashby properties would be managed by Eleanor under their independent registration going forward. She would retain their full income. She would manage their maintenance and tenant affairs through her own offices, as she had already begun to do. Mr. Pemberton would be the solicitor of record. Mr. Vane's office would receive courtesy notifications where the settlement terms required it. In exchange, Eleanor would manage the formal separation of the household affairs in an orderly and discreet manner. She had no interest in public proceedings. She had no interest in scandal. She had no interest in whatever narrative Aldous chose to construct for the benefit of the social circles he had always cared more about than she had. What she had an interest in was the clean and complete conclusion of an arrangement that had not served either of them and that was costing her, specifically, significantly more than it cost him. Aldous's solicitor Fitch, a man of considerable experience and the professional expression of someone reviewing a document and finding it unexpectedly reasonable, made several small technical inquiries. Mr. Pemberton answered them with the precision of a man who had been building this structure for some time. Aldous touched the gold signet ring. He looked at the terms. He looked at Eleanor. Something moved across his face, not the pleasant certainty of the study, not the controlled expression of a man managing a situation. Something more honest than either. Something that might have been, if it had arrived 7 years earlier, the beginning of a real conversation. Eleanor, he said, with the tone of a man trying on the sound of her name as though it is something he has not actually used correctly before. She looked at him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He appeared to be attempting to locate language for something that he had never had to put into language before because it had never previously been required of him. She waited. She had waited for 7 years. She could wait 3 more minutes. He said, "I did not intend." He stopped. He said, "I should have." He stopped again. Eleanor looked at him with the patient, clear attention she brought to everything she intended to understand. She was not going to finish his sentence for him. She had spent 7 years finishing his sentences for him in one form or another, managing the gap between what he might say and what the situation required. She was not going to do it here. He said, finally, with the halting precision of someone saying a thing they have never said before and finding that they do not quite have the architecture for it, "I was not paying sufficient attention." Eleanor considered this. "No," she said. "You were not." A pause. "I am sorry for it," he said. The words were awkward, the words of a man who is not practiced at apology and is attempting it in the manner of someone who has been advised that it is the appropriate action and is therefore doing it without the lived experience of what it is supposed to mean. Eleanor recognized this. She had, over the years, identified every variation of Aldous's performed gestures and his genuine ones, and this, unexpectedly, was genuine, not deep, not transformative, not the apology of a man who had fully understood what he had done or what it had cost, but genuine in the limited way available to someone whose self-awareness had, until this particular month, not been pressed into service. She received it for what it was. She said, "I believe we can complete the terms without further difficulty." Aldous nodded. He picked up the pen. He signed. Mr. Pemberton, across the table, made a notation in his ledger with the careful handwriting of a man recording the completion of something he began 3 weeks ago and intended to complete correctly. He looked up at Eleanor. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look said everything it needed to say. Mr. Fitch gathered his copies of the documentation and placed them in his case with the professional efficiency of someone concluding a proceeding that had gone considerably better than he had been led to expect. Aldous stood. He looked at Eleanor one more time. There was something in his grey eyes that she could not entirely read, whether it was regret, or recognition, or simply the dull adjustment of a world that had rearranged itself around a different center. She did not try to name it. It was not her job to name it anymore. It had never been her job. She stood. She picked up her own copy of the documentation. She thanked Mr. Pemberton. She shook Mr. Fitch's hand, because Mr. Fitch had been professional throughout and professionalism deserved acknowledgement. She walked to the door of Mr. Pemberton's office. She went out into the London afternoon. Constance was there. Of course Constance was there, she was in the carriage at the curb, and she leaned out of the window and looked at Eleanor's face and read it with the complete, accurate attention of 15 years of friendship and said, "Done." "Done," Eleanor confirmed. Constance opened the carriage door. "Good," she said. "Because I have made a reservation at Claridge's for 3 o'clock. Mrs. Dorothy is already there." Eleanor stopped on the pavement. You made a reservation at Claridge's for 3 o'clock without knowing how the meeting would end. Constance raised one eyebrow. I knew how the meeting would end. Get in the carriage, Eleanor. Eleanor got in the carriage. Mrs. Dorothy Ashby was already at the table at Claridge's when they arrived, in her best lavender afternoon dress with the cameo brooch and the expression of someone who has been sitting in a good hotel for 20 minutes and has had time to feel every single emotion she has been holding back for several years and is now in the peculiar state of a woman who has come out the other side of all of them and arrived somewhere that resembles, tentatively and with some disbelief, relief. She stood when Eleanor came through the door. She looked at her daughter's face. She said nothing at all. She simply reached for Eleanor's hands and held them with both of her own warm, slightly trembling ones, and the warmth of her was, as it always had been, the specific warmth of someone who loves you absolutely and has never known the right way to show it and shows it anyway with everything they have. Eleanor held her mother's hands. She felt, quite suddenly and without warning, the full accumulated weight of the last 7 years pressing against the back of her throat in the particular way that it only ever does once the thing it has been building behind finally gives way. She did not weep in Claridge's. This was not the place for weeping, and she was not yet ready to weep. The weeping would come later, privately, in her new offices, at her own desk, in her own time, and it would be the kind of weeping that is not grief but release, the sound of a woman putting down a weight she has been carrying in the specific quiet of her own spine for 7 years. And it would be brief and complete, and after it she would wash her face and go back to the correspondence and continue building. But here, at Claridge's, with her mother's hands and Constance already consulting the menu with the focused authority of someone who has earned this afternoon's extravagance on behalf of everyone in her vicinity, Eleanor simply sat down. She breathed. She looked at the 2 women across the table from her, the mother who had always loved her more capably than she had been equipped to show, and the friend who had been waiting for this day with 17 ideas and the patience to hold all of them until the correct moment arrived. She thought about her father. About the settlement terms he had insisted upon. About Mr. Pemberton's handshake on her wedding morning and what it had meant. About the 4 journal volumes she had left behind in the Ashby library, tucked behind the medicinal herbs, and the 3 pages she had added to the 5th volume on that October night with the candle burning down and her mind finally moving in the direction she had known it needed to move. She thought about what it meant to have been given, by a father who had not fully understood her and had loved her in the limited way available to him, a door. A door he had built into the wall with his own careful, practical hands and his solicitor's precise language and his stubborn refusal to sign a settlement that did not protect her, even though he had not fully believed she would ever need the protection. She had needed the protection. She had found the door. She had walked through it. The waiter arrived. Constance ordered for all 3 of them with the confident authority of a woman who has been looking forward to this afternoon and intends to do it properly. Mrs. Dorothy fussed with her napkin. The afternoon light through the Claridge's windows was the particular golden light of a late London October afternoon, and it fell across the table and across Eleanor's chestnut hair and across her mother's silver-streaked auburn, and Constance's dark ringlets, and the 3 of them were, in that light, simply women at a table. Women who had navigated the particular difficulty of existing in a world that had not designed itself with their navigation in mind, and who had navigated it anyway, and who were here. Eleanor picked up her teacup. "To my father," she said again. "And to Mr. Pemberton." "And to the door," said Constance, who had been told the full story at the tea table 3 weeks ago and had sat with the particular still fury of someone who loves you and has recognized an injury clearly and filed it precisely under the heading of things that have been corrected. "And to you," said Mrs. Dorothy, looking at Eleanor with the warm brown eyes that contained 7 years of held breath finally released. "To you, my darling. Because you did not break." Eleanor looked at her mother. She had not broken. She had managed, had contained, had been useful and efficient and composed and present, and she had carried all of it in the architecture of her spine for 7 years, and she had finally, with the specific clean precision of a woman who had always known where the door was and had finally decided to open it, walked through it. "No," Eleanor said. "I did not break." She drank her tea. Outside the Claridge's window London went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that a woman had just finished the most important meeting of her life and was sitting in a good hotel with her mother and her oldest friend, drinking tea and breathing. In the months that followed, Eleanor Ashby managed the 3 northern estates with a competence and directness that the estate managers, who had been dealing with the intermediary of the Ravensworth household for 7 years, received with the undisguised relief of people who have finally been given a clear line to the person who actually makes decisions. The accounts improved further. The tenant relations, which had been Eleanor's doing quietly for years, became more formally her doing. She hired a small staff for her Mayfair offices. She took on 2 additional properties as consulting management commissions through recommendations from people who had heard, in the specific way that reputation moves in closed circles, that Eleanor Ashby knew the numbers. She wrote, for herself, in the 5th journal volume, a record of everything. Not as grievance, as documentation. Numbers do not lie to protect your feelings. People do. The documentation was for herself, a precise accounting of what had happened and what it had cost and what it had ultimately produced, so that she would never, in any future moment of uncertainty, forget the full calculation. Constance visited the Mayfair offices so frequently that Eleanor eventually designated a chair with a small plaque she had made engraved with the words, 17 Ideas. Constance considered this the finest professional honor she had received. Mrs. Dorothy came every Thursday. She brought the violets when they were in season. The small pot on the window ledge was a constant, a specific warmth in a room that was otherwise the warmth of competent work and the quiet satisfaction of things correctly done. And on one particular Thursday, in the following spring, when the afternoon light was the warm yellow of a late-season afternoon and the estate correspondence was sorted on the desk and the accounts from the northern properties were running at a margin Eleanor had projected 8 months before with complete accuracy, Eleanor opened the current journal volume to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote 2 sentences. The first, every number I recorded was correct. The second, I knew where the door was. I simply had to decide to open it. She closed the journal. She looked out her office window at the London street below. The city went about its business, cabs and foot traffic and the ordinary determined energy of people going in the direction they had chosen, or the direction they had been sent, or the direction they were still in the process of choosing. Eleanor Ashby looked at the street for a long, quiet moment. Then she turned back to the correspondence. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. The difference was that now the work was hers, and the desk was hers, and the offices were hers, and the name on the door, Pemberton for legal, and on the office below, E. Ashby, estate management, was hers. Her father had built her a door. She had decided to open it. And it turned out that on the other side of it was exactly what she had always known how to do, simply without anyone else in the room deciding whether she was worth the doing. She picked up her pen. She began. If Eleanor's story found you somewhere real, if the 7 years of composure and the corridor and the portfolio under her arm and the door she finally walked through found you in a moment of your own, then you are already in the right place. Subscribe to Regent Hearts if you are not already here. Every story on this channel is about the person in the room that the room forgot was listening. Every story is about the settlement clause that someone's father built and someone's daughter finally read. Every story is about the woman who did not break. Hit the like button if you stayed all the way here. Drop a comment with where you are watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know who is in this room with me. And then, do not close this window. Because the next woman has her hand on her own door. We will see you there.